Where the Stars Do Not Take Sides by Witch of Endor, Chapter 8. And never turn to night. Try and fill us with your hate, and we will shine a light. And the days will become endless, and never, never turn to night. Azula is among the best firebenders in the world. If she isn't the best already, then she will be there before long. And Aang is a prodigy in general. This all adds to Zuko's growing frustration because he just cannot find the words to explain his spending to them. I think it's like an extension. Zuko tries, frowning at his sword. Azula is holding his pearl-handed dagger, but Zuko has insisted that Aang not try this with his highly flammable glider, so he's holding a stick instead. When Piandao taught me, he said that the sword has to be an extension of you. He's probably teaching Sokka that right now. Aang frowns at his stick. He's started rising with the sun like a true firebender, and Zuko is sure that if he can do this, Aang can too. Minutes later, the stick is a pile of ash. Aang looks disappointed. Zuko purses his lips. Zuko knows that the problem is Zuko, who has no vocabulary for this, not Aang or Azula. He sighs. Azula turns the pearl-handed dagger over in her hands. Try it with this, she suggests, holding the dagger out. We should check that it's not just the swords that you can do it with. Zuko takes the dagger. It feels familiar to his hands, but the weight is alien now because he's stronger than the last time he held it. He concentrates and allows flames to lick up and down the blade just like his hand. He then points the dagger at the nearby rocks and allows the blast of fire to extend from it. He twists his wrist and encourages the fire into a whip. It's not quite the same as his swords, with which he is practiced, but the theory is playing out in practice. Azula's curiosity only seems to grow. Try a stick? She asks, and then she has Zuko put his hands on a boulder and set the whole thing alight, holding the fire there without burning the moss. Azula pokes at it with the stick, and the stick catches fire even where the moss doesn't. Intriguing, she says, but ultimately I don't think it's useful enough to spend time on right now. Her eyes flash. Though I will learn that trick when we have time. That's when they hear the first boom. For a moment, Zuko thinks that they're being attacked. They're not. It turns out that one unexpected consequence of Azula speaking her mind the night before is that Toph and King Boomy feel the need to go to battle to see who's the better earthbender. Azula chooses a seat with a good view and roots unapologetically, albeit slightly threateningly, for Toph. Zuko, on the other hand, knows when a quick escape is advisable, and he takes off to find Master Piandao and Sokka. He thinks that maybe Piandao can give him the vocabulary he needs to make Aang and Azula understand that the sword is an extension of him. But then he realizes that Piandao would probably think it's ridiculous if he tries to claim that the boulder is an extension of him too. But Azula is probably right anyway. It's not useful enough to bother with in the lead up to battle. Zuko finds them in a clearing around the corner from the camp. Sokka has a very serious expression on his face. Zuko can't seem to stop his own expression from softening when he sees it. He sits on a box and watches the two of them for several long minutes. The threat of attack looms in the background. The reality of battle draws ever closer. And Zuko has somehow never been this content. He almost feels guilty about it. Surely now, of all times, it's inappropriate to feel anything but worry. But while that is there, churning under the surface, he has also never been this surrounded by people he cares about before, who seem to care about him too. Azula is close enough to hear, sitting on a makeshift throne of boxes and rocks as she shouts encouragements thinly disguised as insults. His other friends know who he is, and that knowledge somehow hasn't torn them away from him. And Sokka looks very serious as he learns to use a sword, learning from the same man who once taught Zuko. When Sokka realizes he's there, their eyes meet, and Sokka hesitates and smiles back at him. Of course, that's when Piandao disarms it. It is paramount that you do not get distracted while fighting. Piandao points out, and Sokka goes scarlet. Right? Of course, sorry. Piandao looks at Zuko and then to the skies as if he's asking for patience. That, of course, is when another boom sounds from the direction of the earthbending challenge. Piandao frowns. Toph and King Boomy are having whatever the earthbending equivalent of an Agni Kai is. Zuko explains. Azula is judging. Give me strength. Piandao requests of the spirits and then nods to Sokka. That is enough for today. I will see you here again tomorrow at dawn. You will practice in the meantime. Piandao leaves in the direction of the noise. Sorry, Zuko says, looking back to Sokka. I didn't mean to interrupt. Sokka sheathes his sword and then rubs at the back of his neck. I think that was mostly my fault for getting distracted. And I guess Toph's fault for beating up a king, but you can't blame Toph for being Toph. Zuko smiles again, and he feels like it comes more easily to his face than ever before. Sokka smiles right back and then seems to shake himself. He leans the sheathed sword up against the boxes and joins Zuko sitting beside him and looking vaguely in the direction of the danger. They can't see anything from this angle, but the ground occasionally shakes and Azula occasionally laughs. So I was jerk-bending with the jerk-benders? Sokka asks, swinging his legs slightly and knocking his heels into the box he's sitting on. Zuko shrugs. They wanted to learn about what I do with the swords, but I can't really explain it. Zuko admits. I think that was frustrating for Aang. I think I have a vocabulary for the basics, but I don't have any words for this. Well, duh, because you invented it, Sokka points out. There isn't a technique yet. It's inside you. Have you tried to get Toph to explain metal bending yet? Because I'm fairly certain some of the words she uses aren't even words. When Sokka puts it like that, it makes Zuko feel less like a failure. Thanks, he says, and Sokka turns his head to look at him again. For what? Zuko shrugs. For making it sound like I'm not an idiot feels a little telling, so he doesn't say it. For being you, I guess, is what he settles on, and then realizes that's just as telling. Sokka's eyes are so bright. For a moment, Zuko feels caught in them, drawn to the flame. And then Sokka's smile fades, but it also blooms into something new. Zuko, Sokka says, I wanted to ask you something, but I want you to know first that you don't have to say yes and nothing changes if you say no. Zuko tilts his head. Okay, he encourages. Sokka draws a deep breath and then releases it slowly. Can I kiss you again? Surprise shoots down Zuko's spine and he sits up straighter. Oh, is all he can manage to say. He thought they'd been over this and that Sokka's answer had been no. Twice! Once at the campsite the night after Zuko's return and once on the ship. But if Sokka is asking again now, maybe Zuko misunderstood the answer before. Sokka sits back too, and his expression is less bright now. He isn't looking at Zuko, who has let silence fall between them in his surprise. Zuko swallows and then moves his hand to cover Sokka's. Sokka looks down at their hands, and then up at Zuko. And Zuko gathers all of his courage and leans in to kiss him. It becomes abruptly obvious to Zuko that their previous 2 kisses had been one-sided. This is what kissing Sokka actually feels like. And it feels amazing. Sokka cups both of his hands around Zuko's face, and Zuko is suddenly overcome with the need to get as close as possible. He tries to hold himself back, but it's a challenge. He instead quiets himself by kissing harder, by grasping onto Sokka's forearms, and is embarrassed by the small sound that escapes him when Sokka pulls back and rests their foreheads together. Sokka is grinning. I have wanted to do that, he says, breathless and almost laughing, since the day I met you. That's not true, but Zuko doesn't let himself dwell on it. Instead, he leans in again. The challenge ultimately comes to a standstill because the adults are concerned that Toph and King Boomy might either kill one another or alert some passing strangers to their camp. Azula does not like ties. She likes victory. That being said, Toph then gets the idea to build them a battleground out of rock. With Azula's assistance, she builds Royal Caldera City, its entrances and walls, its palace, down to the finest details. Pian Bao comes by to check their specifications, as do 2 other Fire Nation councilmen. And then Toph builds little figures for their army, and Azula abruptly feels like she's a child playing at war instead of the next Fire Lord. She likes her own figure, though. Rock Azula is standing in an attacking pose, hands filled with flame. The figures don't have faces, presumably because Toph is blind and doesn't see the need for them, and it makes all the figures that much creepier and more wonderful. Sokka finally enters the tent long minutes after Azula has called for his presence. Toph is working on little Fire Nation army figurines while Azula places their fighters in the city. "Oh, good," she says. "You finally let go of my brother's face long enough to strategize with me." Sokka goes red immediately. "What? How did—" "I have spies everywhere," Azula responds, moving around the table with the model of the city. Sokka huffs. "Toph, you're the worst!" he complains, and Toph laughs. "Wait, is this what I think it is?" Azula looks up with a grin. "Royal Caldera City," she explains, and then finds the Sokka figurine and hands it to him. Sokka looks like he might cry. "You gave me a little boomerang! Toph, you're the best!" Yeah, I'm a genius," Toph responds, still grumpy from the lack of clear victory earlier in the day. Azula rearranges a little and then says, "Let's walk through Scenario 1. Scenario 1 is the least likely version of this battle, in which everything goes according to plan and nobody turns traitor. They're halfway through the scene, Toph moving the armies while Azula and Sokka give directions, when Sokka raises a hand to pause them. "Whoa, wait, where's Zuko?" he asks, looking over the board. The rest of the team are entering the palace now. Azula rearranges her Dai Li and then points down to where Zuko's piece is situated. "He's not with us." "He's with Chief Hakoda and the Water Tribe warriors," Azula responds. "So, if we've set this up correctly, this is the moment that the sun disappears." Sokka is squinting over at Zuko's figurine now, placed carefully next to Hakoda's. Zuko's figurine has one sword extended forwards and the other behind him, creating a blast of fire over his own head. Azula thinks that is not a useful move at all, but it looks good. "Why?" "Because we said that entering the palace would be the most effective timing for it," Azula reminds him. "It gives us the biggest lead for an altercation with the Fire Lord." "He means, why isn't Zuko with the rest of us?" Toph corrects. Sokka nods. "He's a heavy hitter with or without the fire," he points out. "He should be part of the palace team." He goes to pick up Zuko's figurine. Azula extends a hand, stopping him. "No, Zuko stays with Hakoda." Sokka is staring. Azula looks up with a glare because he needs to remember that this is her battleground, whether or not Sokka is her chief strategist, and her brother, whether or not Sokka is stupid and lovesick over him. Eventually, Azula states, "Your dissent is noted," and dismissed, she doesn't add, but she's sure he hears it. The old man arrives the next day. Azula is firebending when it happens. Aang is finally starting to master some of the more complicated forms, and while Zuko still can't explain the weird bending he stepped into with the swords, he's at least practicing it in a way that might be useful. And then King Bumi is approaching them to let them know that Prince Iroh will be there in minutes. Azula finds space for them to meet, and then sighs to herself in annoyance as she prepares tea. "I didn't know you liked tea," Zuzu says, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "I don't," Azula replies, "but he's only going to request it once he gets here. Might as well get it over with so that we can move on to planning." Azula doesn't like tea, but she drank a truly inordinate amount while living in the palace. Iroh was a constant annoyance in her life, like a fly buzzing around her ears, offering meaningless sayings like they were nuggets of wisdom. Azula is sure that she has never once enjoyed a session with him. But she also kept taking them for years and years, so she knows how he likes his stupid tea. When Iroh arrives, she and Zuko stand. Zuko goes to bow and Azula goes to offer a greeting, but they're both interrupted by Uncle Iroh drawing a very loud breath and declaring,
"My dear niece and nephew, look at you."
"Uncle," Zuko says carefully, like he's still testing out the sound of the word in his mouth.
"Zuko,"
Iroh says, turning to him. He holds out his arms, but Zuko doesn't come to him. He lets that go quickly and elegantly.
"It is such a pleasure to see you alive and well."
Zuko bows. "And you, Uncle."
"And Azula,"
Iroh says, offering the same hug to her. Azula doesn't approach either, but she also offers a bow, which he thinks is more than sufficient.
"The future Fire Lord herself, how magnificent to see you."
His eyes slip behind her and he beams.
"And you have prepared tea for an old uncle."
Zuko gives Azula the slightly panicked look of someone who isn't used to being in Prince Iroh's presence. Azula sits down and allows Iroh to serve the tea, but she doesn't bother drinking. She knows that she won't like it. Zuko does drink, eyeing both of them over his cup. Uncle Iroh looks elated as he sits across from them.
"I am so pleased that you located the White Lotus," he says. "I had worried that it was a most difficult task, but we had no time for anything else."
"You're part of a secret organization planning to bring down my father," Azula states, because it needs stating. Iroh's eyes move to her.
"No, my dear. The White Lotus is not traditionally a political organization. However, it is becoming increasingly clear that the war will not end under the current Fire Lord, and it is suffice to say that your stories have traveled far and wide."
"What stories?" Zuko asks. Uncle Iroh smiles.
"The Lost Prince. Azula, I understand that you bestowed a title."
"The Phoenix Prince," Azula says with a smirk because she knows that Iroh will understand. Uncle Iroh chuckles.
"My brother will not like that,"
he says.
"Yes, a prince and a princess pulled apart. A war tearing through the world. The prince and princess reunited and taking their terrible father's throne in the name of peace."
Iroh smiles serenely.
"It helps, of course, that your people already know you to be strong, Princess Azula. To that strength you have added loyalty, love, and the pursuit of peace."
His eyes sparkle at her the way that they sometimes have in their regular meetings. Azula used to ignore it. Now she doesn't.
"The reign of Fire Lord Azula will be legendary, I am sure of it."
Azula only nods. Uncle Iroh drinks.
"But first we have a battle to fight for the throne. Unlaid eggs are uncertain Komodo chickens."
Azula rolls her eyes. Uncle Iroh turns his smile to Zuko.
"Has your sister explained the, intent behind your new title, nephew?"
he asks, and Zuko only responds with a confused glance in Azula's direction.
"Your father, the Fire Lord,"
Iroh corrects, as if he doesn't want to think of Ozai as their father at all.
"He has longed for the title Phoenix King for some time. His plans for the comet, his plans to reign over the broken world, are to culminate in bestowing the title Phoenix King upon himself."
Zuko turns to Azula. "You didn't tell me about those plans," he points out. Azula shrugs. "Sokka and I decided that it wasn't worth worrying anyone. We're planning to strike long before the comet. We didn't want to put more pressure on Aang." Zuko's face softens at the mention of the Avatar. "Okay," he agrees and apparently lets it go. Azula would have told him if he would spend more than minutes in planning meetings, but it seems to Azula that Zuko doesn't really want to know those ins and outs. And anyway, she has Sokka for this. Iroh looks between the two of them.
"Perhaps I should tell you about the royal court in your absence,"
he suggests. Azula nods. "Are you going back there?" Iroh looks thoughtful and then stalls by taking another drink.
"While the Fire Lord thinks I am on a diplomatic mission," he says carefully, "I don't doubt that he is suspicious of my loyalties. I think I should not return to court until it is by your side, niece.
Then tell me about how the court has fallen apart without me. Azula suggests, and Uncle Iroh smiles. Azula prefers to take the first watch. The most significant reason that Azula prefers the first watch is that this group like to chat before going to sleep, and it is endlessly annoying. They will lie there for an hour easily just talking about nonsense. It makes Azula miss the quiet room she shared with Zuko on the ship, in which they would not entertain small talk because small talk is inherently stupid. Now, however, they are sharing a tent with the whole group. While she and Zuko had spent many nights guarding one another, the truth is that Azula hasn't really had to take watch before this situation. The few situations in which she has been without guards at night, Azula has stayed awake. There were some nights alone with May and Ty Lee, but they were few and far between. The new normal of sharing watch with a group still doesn't sit well with her. The first watch allows Azula to extract herself from their inane conversations, but it also means that some of the White Lotus members have yet to retire to their own tents. She watches from a distance as Iroh converses with another robed member, and she wonders about his loyalties. Azula doesn't doubt that Iroh would betray Father. Father deserves the betrayal, after all. Uncle Iroh had adored Zuko. Just like with Mother, Zuko had been Iroh's favorite. It hardly mattered at the time because Azula was the talented and intelligent child, and she was Father's favorite. Being Father's favorite meant a lot more than Mother's love or Uncle Iroh's affection. At the time, at least. Now, being Father's favorite simply means that Azula has more leverage to twist the knife in his back. What Azula does doubt is Iroh's loyalty to her. Iroh is, after all, a legitimate contender for her throne. Zuzu is too, but she believes him when he says that he doesn't want it. Iroh is harder to read, and the White Lotus is loyal to Azula only through Iroh. Silently, Azula begins to plot out the possibility of Scenario 6. She will need to run it through with Sokka tomorrow, but she has the time to draft an outline right now, so she does. There's also a scenario in which the Avatar and his friends join the White Lotus against her. Azula thinks this one is less likely, but complacency topples empires, so she knows that she will have to plan for the possibility anyway. Sokka cannot help with that particular plan, of course, but Azula doesn't doubt that Sokka knows that there will be a plan. Iroh joins her at the entrance to the group's tent and offers her a bow before sitting next to her.
"You're guarding your friends?"
Iroh asks. "I'm taking first watch," Azula corrects him. Iroh nods, and the quiet stretches out between them. Most of the councilmen are retiring now. Azula reaches out to bring the fire of the closest torch higher, casting more light for her watch.
"There is something I believe you should know, niece,"
Iroh says, watching her in the dim light. Their conversation about allies and the royal court lasted hours. Azula wonders why her uncle would approach her at night and alone, and then turns her mind to her brother and her strategist. At least one of them had been present at all times. Perhaps this is something meant only for Azula's ears. "Then speak," Azula commands. Iroh continues to watch her until Azula meets his eyes, and then he continues.
"I had wondered about telling you years ago," he admits, "but I always assumed that you would not see this as useful to know. You were loyal to the Fire Lord before Zuko rose from the ashes."
Azula narrows her eyes, and Iroh looks thoughtful for a moment before continuing.
"But you being here now with the Avatar, ready to take the place of Fire Lord, I do believe that this is destiny at work."
Azula rolls her eyes. "Destiny," she repeats, unimpressed.
"I know that you are aware of our family tree," Iroh continues. "You know the names of all your ancestors on your father's side. Each Fire Lord before you, the second and the children, the wives, perhaps even the names of the parents of the Fire Ladies. What you may be less aware of is your mother's heritage."
Iroh is correct, of course. Why should Azula know more than her grandparents' names? She has never even met them. "Are mother's parents alive?" Azula asks, assuming that this is why Iroh is bringing them up.
"I am afraid not,"
Iroh responds in a kind tone, as if he thinks that Azula will care. Jinzuk and Rena are just names in a book to her.
Then what does Mother's heritage matter? Azula asks.
Iroh sits back slightly, gaze unwavering.
Azula, you know that your great-grandfather was Fire Lord Sozin, the man who began the war that you are set on ending.
Azula raises her chin, refusing to pay attention to the weight of her ancestry on her shoulders.
What you do not know is that your other great-grandfather, Rena's father, was Avatar Roku.
That information takes a moment to settle. This means that Azula is the descendant of the Fire Lord who started the war, and the Avatar who died trying to stop it. She looks away from Uncle Iroh toward the sky. The weight of her ancestry is still there, but it has perhaps shifted.
This is why I think that your reign is destiny, Azula.
Iroh continues, voice gentle.
You were born with potential to walk either path, potential for great power to crush the world or to heal it.
But Azula is doing what she wants to do with this war, not what her ancestors set her up to do, regardless of who those ancestors are. Azula is not a pawn in anyone else's game. Azula slants a glare toward Iroh. I don't believe in destiny, she decides. Uncle Iroh smiles. He often smiles at her, but his expression has shifted from their meetings in the gardens and tea rooms of the palace.
You found the Avatar and joined him of your own volition, without knowing that his predecessor is your ancestor. In the midst of searching for the Avatar to bring it back to your father, you found your brother, who has been lost to us all for years.
Uncle Iroh's smile broadens.
You may not believe in destiny, Princess Azula, but I do suspect that destiny believes in you.
Azula looks to the skies again.
Wow, Uncle, you really outdid yourself there.
Uncle Iroh chuckles and then stands and bows. Azula watches as he retires from the evening. Azula will still plan for the possibility of Iroh's betrayal, of course, but she expects that she will not need it.
Do you think you could set the tent on fire?
Azula asks. Zuko lets the fire licking the ground around him die down. He also studiously ignores where Toph is excitedly chanting, Flaming boulders! Flaming boulders!
Yes, obviously, Zuko responds, but I don't think the White Lotus would like it very much.
Azula gives him a long, flat look. Zuko knows that this means he is being exceptionally slow.
I mean, she drawls, could you set the tent on fire without letting it burn down?
Zuko looks at one of the tents thoughtfully. If he could do it with a boulder without burning the moss.
Well, there's only one way to find out,
he says, and Azula's face lights up. Several people are not happy about this experiment. In Zuko's defense, he doesn't burn the tent down after all. Azula spends the afternoon sparring with Katara. Katara is clearly antsy about when her father is going to arrive and what it means if he doesn't. Azula is filled with spare energy from last night's conversation with Uncle Iroh, trying to figure out what to do with the information about Avatar Roku. It's obvious to Azula that she cannot ever tell Aang because he will definitely be annoying about this information. She isn't even sure if she should tell Zuko, whom she basically has to lure back to the royal court like a spooked flutterbat. Hopefully Uncle Iroh won't try to talk to him about destiny anytime soon. Once Azula and Katara are both bruised and tired, they take their leave of sparring and go to rejoin the groups. Azula goes to the planning tent to see if Sokka is there. They still haven't ironed out the 5th scenario, and Azula is starting to be concerned that they need to take it back to basics. She isn't expecting to find Zuko in the tent. Zuko is standing on the opposite side of Royal Caldera City, looking down at where they are midway through the 5th scenario. It can't mean much to him because Zuzu has avoided any serious planning, but he's frowning down at the board nonetheless. Zuko's eyes flicker up to hers and then back down. he says, and then reaches up to fix a non-existent issue with his top knot. He gives up after a moment and lets his hands fall to the edge of the rocky scene.
I thought I should get a little more involved.
Zuko's mouth pulls downward as he looks down the board at his own piece.
But I see you don't agree.
We're halfway through a scenario we're running, Azula explains. This isn't going to make any sense to you. Zuko hesitates and then nods. He's still looking at his own little rock player with his twin swords and fire.
I'm trying not to assume that you're just getting me out of the way down there.
It's a bad assumption, and Azula suspects that Zuko knows that's the case. Well then, cards on the table. I've kept you with Chief Hakoda.
And away from the palace.
Zuko continues, looking up the board to where Azula's team have just entered the palace.
And away from you.
Azula hums and reaches out to shift the avatar on the board. Do you object? She pays careful attention to his face, but Zuko doesn't give much away. He does, however, draw a breath just deep enough to sound like a sigh.
Not if you think I would get in the way.
Good, Azula replies. She wonders if she should tell him about Avatar Roku. She wonders what will happen if Aang and his company do turn against her, as unlikely as it is to happen. Zuko's shoulders fall slightly, and he doesn't look up at Azula. But then his face shifts, tightens, and so does his posture, and he meets her eyes before stating,
You said that I go where you go.
Azula did say that, didn't she? She meant it in the context of their travels, not in the context of battle, but it's an easy extrapolation. And because Azula was already considering what happens in the wake of a rebellion from Zuko's friends, she finds herself asking, What if I left? Zuko blinks, clearly caught off guard, and says,
What?
What if I decide that this isn't for me after all? What if Azula decided to make her own destiny? Would you go where I go then? Azula is expecting an answer. Honestly, she's expecting Zuzu to say yes, whether or not he means it, because it would strengthen his protest to the battle strategy. But she doesn't get one straight away. Instead, she watches as Zuko's expression turns surprised, and then, very, very slowly, the muscles in his face relax. For a moment, Azula is off balance because she doesn't understand that reaction, and she thinks she's getting pretty good at understanding her brother. Zuko's bright eyes go a little duller, and then he looks away from Azula and nods once, decisively. Zuko clears his throat.
Can I say goodbye?
What? Azula asks, still trying to sew together the threads of this conversation. To whom? Zuko goes to frown and then apparently thinks better of it.
To everyone,
he explains. His voice is rougher than usual. He still isn't looking at her. And then abruptly, Azula understands Zuzu's stupid reaction. She sighs, annoyed, and knocks her knuckles against the rock city to get his attention. Hey, idiot! Stop brooding! I'm not actually suggesting that we leave. Zuko hesitates and then closes his eyes with relief so palpable that it's honestly a little insulting.
no.
Though Azula is insulted by his relief, something in her has also calmed a little at the realization that Zuko really would leave with her. He would leave this whole life he's built for himself from scraps. His friends, possibly the first friends he's envisioned an actual future with. Whatever is happening with Sokka, he would leave it all behind if she asked him to. That's a lot of power that he's handed over to her. Abruptly, Azula realizes that she hasn't actually considered planning for a scenario in which Zuko betrays her. That's an oversight, and it's completely ridiculous, and she'll have to fix it. This also serves to solidify her decision to keep him out of the battle. It's not a slight, Azula explains. When Zuko looks up at her, apparently still recovering from their misunderstanding, Azula nods back to the board. Hakoda will look after you. That's all.
Zuko scowls. I don't need looking after,
he insists.
I've been taking care of myself for a long time now.
but his scowl is somehow less troubled as he looks back and forth between Azula and the Rock City.
And I'm not going to be safe, wherever you put me in the battle.
It feels a little like Zuko was seeing her too clearly, even when he isn't looking directly at her. Azula crosses her arms. You're safer with Hakoda than you would be at the palace.
Barely,
Zuko argues. Azula narrows her eyes. You've almost died twice in that throne room. Are you really looking to test it a third time? Zuko winces and Azula presses where she's found weakness. You basically had a meltdown at the idea of the crown and now you're ready to pluck it from father's head. You're not going to panic and become useless the second...
Azula.
Zuko's voice cuts through her, and it's only then that Azula realizes that her volume and pitch have risen. Zuko crosses his arms too and then breathes deeply. He closes his eyes.
You don't need me as much as you think you do.
Anger flashes. Who says I need you at all? Zuko opens his eyes. He looks angry now too.
If I left,
he says, and then holds up a hand when she goes to interrupt him.
If I left and you didn't know where I was and you became Fire Lord without me, would you still end the war?
Azula hesitates.
You wouldn't have before, Zuko points out. You said that your entire reason for ending the war was because I wanted you to. Is that still true?
Azula goes to say yes, but it trips up in her mind, and she thinks. She thinks about the air nomads, Aang's people, who no longer exist because of Fire Lord Sozin's war, because he killed them all. Azula was taught that the air nomads did it to themselves, that they were taking up arms against the Fire Nation. But Azula knows Aang now, stupid, pacifistic, dripping with kindness Aang, so she knows enough to doubt that claim. Sozin obliterated the air nomads to get to the Avatar, and for no other reason. She thinks about the water tribes and how Katara is a prodigy at her bending, but she grew up with nobody around to teach her. She thinks about how Katara and Sokka's mother was killed on the suspicion of being a bender, how Hakoda and all the men had to leave them behind, that they grew up in a cluster of villages, a home slowly dying before their eyes. Azula was taught that they were backwards savages, but the Water Tribe warriors accepted Azula and Zuko on their ship because they were children in a war, even though they should have considered them enemy combatants. She thinks about the Earth Kingdom, where Zuzu grew up hungry because there wasn't enough food for families, let alone a strange, scarred runaway. Where the people are being crushed under the weight of the war, where Toph is expected to return while it crumbles beneath her feet. How Azula was taught that her nation's war was an attempt to improve the world, but all the Earth Kingdom knows from it is death and hunger. And finally, Azula thinks about her own kingdom, her control of the Fire Nation. How many people that will be depending on her while losing their children to a war built on lies. Azula closes her eyes, irritated at herself and at Zuko, and says, I would still end the war. She hears Zuko's breath as it escapes him, and it isn't words, but it still sounds like,
I thought so.
Azula opens her eyes and looks across the board at her brother. Zuko looks back at her.
You don't need me, Azula.
Zuko continues, softer this time.
You said you need me to be the heart, but you don't need that. You have a heart. I'm not sure why you think you don't.
The corner of his mouth pulls down and he adds,
I think maybe Mother didn't help there.
Just because I don't need you to tell me to end the war doesn't mean you get to die, Azula snaps. Zuko nods.
I don't plan to die,
he says,
but I do plan to fight by your side.
He reaches out to his own piece, the miniature Zuko poised for battle, and plucks it from its place with the Water Tribe warriors. He places it instead next to Azula's figurine. Azula watches this happen, arms still crossed, and then looks up to Zuzu again. If I die, she says, because if she has to hear all this, then so does he. Then you should take the crown.
Zuzu flinches. I don't want the crown.
Azula shrugs. You don't have to want it. But Uncle Iroh is right. Part of what will keep the Fire Nation together is a good story. They'll idolize you if you let them, and it will help in the war.
Zuko doesn't look happy, but he also doesn't object again.
And yes, you'll hate it. So convince Sokka to marry you and figure out how to make babies happen. You can abdicate before long.
Zuko huffs a breath at that, and it's almost a laugh.
Try not to die.
Azula orders and leaves Zuko's figurine next to hers. Zuko goes to leave the tent as Sokka is approaching it. Zuko is still trying to put out the flames of his conversation with Azula, and when Sokka smiles brightly at him, it provides the best distraction from the mess that Zuko has left behind. They haven't found a chance to be alone since yesterday morning. They're sharing a tent with the whole group, and between planning and training and helping out with the running of the camp, there just hasn't been time. And maybe Zuko has found reasons to be busy whenever he isn't, because nervous energy is thrumming beneath his skin. Maybe every time Sokka looks at him and smiles, Zuko's heart rate picks up. Maybe Zuko doesn't know what any of this means, and he's worried that if he tries to figure it out, it will unravel. But when Zuko leaves the tent and Sokka goes to pass him, when Sokka looks up at him with an even bright smile, all of the reasons to keep busy fall away. Zuko reaches out and catches Sokka's hand as he goes to pass. Sokka turns, smile widening, and Zuko hesitates only for a moment before nodding to behind him with his eyebrows raised. Sokka doesn't hesitate at all. Well, okay then, he says, and immediately goes to follow Zuko. Zuko leads them back behind the camp, behind the boxes, to the space that Sokka and Piandao have been using for practice. How's the training going? He asks as casually as he can. Good, Sokka replies, but he's clearly distracted. Zuko spares him a glance over his shoulder, all but dragging him the rest of the way to relative privacy. When they're behind the boxes and Zuko turns around properly, Sokka nonsensically adds, Yeah. When Zuko last kissed Sokka, it was after being invited to. He's less sure this time, facing Sokka while holding his hand again, mostly hidden from view by boxes again. It reminds Zuko of being on the ship, of being so sure that Sokka was going to kiss him and then finding out that he was wrong. And abruptly Zuko is thinking of their makeshift camp again, of being pushed away. Zuko swallows and looks Sokka in his blue eyes, hoping that he isn't wrong this time. Sokka's expression is soft and maybe a little wondering, and it seems that Zuko doesn't need to worry after all because Sokka asks, Can I kiss you again? Zuko ups a breath that is almost a laugh and says, You don't have to ask every time, you know. It's apparently enough of an answer for Sokka, who grins and then leans in and brushes his mouth against Zuko's. Zuko's mind goes blissfully blank as he kisses back. He finds himself grasping at Sokka's biceps without noticing that he's moving, finds that he doesn't want to hold himself back from pressing close, and feels Sokka sigh in response. Zuko isn't sure that anything has ever felt as good as this. And then talking in the distance cuts through, and they pull back and look over toward the camp. They haven't been noticed yet, but they're not hidden enough for true privacy. Zuko wonders about wandering over to the stream nearby, but then Sokka tugs at his arm. When Zuko looks over, Sokka sits down against the row of boxes back to the camp. The boxes are stacked high enough that he's hidden from that angle. Smart, Zuko admits, and Sokka flashes a grin in his direction. That's why I'm the plans guy, he responds. Zuko wants to be closer than they'll be if he sits next to Sokka, because he sees no reason not to. Zuko lowers himself down into Sokka's lap, facing him, hidden from the camp. Sokka goes pink. Maybe you should be the plans guy, he mutters, and Zuko smiles before cupping Sokka's jaw and kissing him again. And maybe Zuko should be the plans guy, because this is even better than before. Zuko can press close now, and his added height shifts the angle in a way that something primal in him really likes. Zuko loses the thread of time as kissing Sokka goes from being careful and new to being messy and a bit desperate. He presses his hands against Sokka's shoulders and then bunches the material of Sokka's shirt in his hands, and Sokka sighs into the kiss. He feels Sokka thread his fingers into his hair, and it causes a small sound to escape from Zuko, and he presses closer still. Sokka pulls back a little, breath coming faster, and says,
Okay, buddy, maybe we should slow down a little.
Zuko doesn't want to slow down at all. What he wants is closer, closer, closer. But he swallows and sits back a little, letting Sokka catch his breath. And Sokka apparently takes this distance as an excuse to slip his hands up Zuko's shirt, hands brushing and then settling against Zuko's ribs. Zuko inhales shakily before leaning back in, and the kiss is less desperate this time. But Zuko can feel his fire burning beneath his skin. Sokka's mouth leaves his to trail instead down Zuko's neck, which is... Okay, wow! He didn't know he could feel like that! Zuko breathes out a point that really needs to be made.
We don't have to slow down.
Sokka pulls back again, shifting Zuko away from him by his waist and simultaneously pressing his forehead against Zuko's shoulder. He lets out a huff that is close to a laugh and says, Are you trying to kill me? Zuko lifts a hand to the back of Sokka's hair and then lowers it to trace the soft skin of his neck. He hums in question.
We're literally outside, Sokka points out, and there's nowhere to go for privacy here. All it takes is someone walking around the corner there.
Face burning in embarrassment, Zuko interrupts.
Okay, bad idea, I get it.
Sokka pulls back from Zuko's shoulder and rests their temples together, and it somehow feels even more intimate to be this close while ignoring the simmering heat between them. They stay there for several moments, allowing themselves to calm down. The part of Zuko's mind that was insisting on closeness is quieting now, and this feels like more than enough.
You feel good,
Zuko admits, because it's suddenly important that Sokka knows that. Sokka's hands slide out from under Zuko's shirt. Zuko gasps a little at the sensation and then the loss, and Sokka grins as he cups Zuko's face. Sokka kisses him again, soft this time, and then traces a thumb over Zuko's bottom lip.
You're so beautiful,
Sokka replies, and the smile slips from Zuko's face. Disappointment settles in his stomach. He pulls back a little.
Don't do that,
he requests, and then tries to distract him from this conversation by kissing him again. Sokka accepts the contact for a moment, but draws away to ask,
Don't do what?
Zuko does not want to have this conversation. He finds himself frowning, and maybe this would be less awkward if Zuko wasn't literally straddling Sokka right now, but it feels like it would be too dramatic to pull away completely. Zuko feels the muscles in his back tensing. Well, Zuko came here for a break from talking about life and death with Azula. This isn't life and death. He can say it.
Don't say things you don't mean,
he requests.
Not with me. I don't want that.
When Sokka just frowns up at him like he's trying to translate Zuko's words, he adds,
I like you a lot, and I'd like for us to be honest with each other, if that's okay.
He feels raw again now, like he's revealed more than he intended to. Sokka's eyes narrow thoughtfully.
Do you think I wasn't being honest when I said that you're beautiful?
He asks, the tone of his voice confused, like this wouldn't make sense as an option, but he can't find another one. Zuko restrains himself from rolling his eyes.
I know what I look like, Sokka,
he says.
Let's pretend you didn't say it.
Well, that doesn't sound very honest,
Sokka points out. Zuko does go to move away at this point, but Sokka's hands fall gently on his forearms. They're not constraining him, just making it clear that Sokka doesn't want him to go.
Okay,
Sokka says carefully.
I'm not sure how to handle this one, but Zuko, you must know that I think you're beautiful. I have not been subtle about that.
Zuko frowns.
The first time we met...
Irritation flickers. I remember how you were when we met.
Zuko points out.
You were weirded out about Scar, and that's fine, I get it, it's disfiguring, people react.
Zuko, seriously, the first time we met Katara, I realized that I danced on that side of the campfire just from the way that I looked at you.
Sokka winces at the memory.
I maybe also realized that from the way that I looked at you.
Zuko blinks and then looks for dishonesty in Sokka's face. Sokka just looks uncomfortable.
I don't know how you missed it. The whole thing became Toph's favorite joke, you know? You can literally ask any of our friends, or really, really embarrassingly, your sister.
At Zuko's confused frown, Sokka adds,
I may have gotten carried away when talking to her about you. Specifically about that time that you decided to strip and bathe in front of us all.
Zuko recalls that day and tries to read it through a different lens. I did keep my underwear on,
he points out. And thank the spirits you did, because otherwise I might not have lived to tell the tale.
Sokka jokes.
And then, you know, I kissed you.
He shrugs.
Like I said, not subtle.
You pushed me away,
Zuko points out.
Sokka stares for a moment, incredulous, and then replies,
Yes, because I was mad at you and you tried to use the fact that I liked you to distract me from that.
Zuko just stares as he tries to filter this information. Oh, he says eventually because he thinks he's supposed to say something. Sorry about that.
Sokka's expression turns suspicious. What did you think was happening here if you didn't think that I...
And Zuko isn't even sure what he thought. He supposes that he mostly didn't think. He just let himself be swept along with the tide. And maybe a part of him had assumed words like convenient, but those thoughts don't stand up to much scrutiny. I guess I just didn't think, Zuko admits in the name of honesty.
Sokka chuckles. Yeah, maybe you shouldn't be the plans guy,
he says, and then tugs Zuko a little closer. Zuko goes easily this time, and maybe he's still a little confused by how this happened, but he can be confused and happy at the same time. The Water Tribe warriors joined them later that day, led by Chief Hakoda and accompanied by May and Ty Lee. Azula catches Zuko's eyes and drags him after her without physical contact until the Fire Nation children are close. Ty Lee hugs them both. They both put up with it.
I trust everything was well on the ship, Azula asks.
It's intended to sound like small talk, but Azula doesn't do small talk. She wants to know if the Water Tribe crew were different without royalty aboard. May understands this and reports back.
It was completely boring.
Ty Lee, of course, never quite understands Azula's subtlety the first time around. She spins tales from the ship, most of which are as boring as May claimed, but come with a hint of adoration of Chief Hakoda and several other members of the crew. Satisfied that her friends are well, and her allies have yet to betray her, Azula leads May and Ty Lee to the group's tent. May is, of course, singularly unimpressed with the idea of having to share sleeping quarters. And Ty Lee is, of course, delighted. Azula and Zuko are both untrusting by nature. It makes a conversation about running through plans with their allies a long and stilted one. Zuko listens carefully, but through most of the discussion, he finds himself off-kilter. The problem is that the nature of their distrust is not the same. Zuko's is born in violence and hunger and pressing advantage. Azula's experiences might look prettier, and the dangers of the court may be subtler, but the threat of betrayal was constantly lingering in the shadows. Zuko thinks that her world seems so much more complicated than his. In Zuko's experience, people will hold what you owe them for their advantage, and they will take food from your plate, and they won't care if you live or die. In Azula's, the blades are hidden in beautiful smiles and careful words. The sun goes down during their conversation. Azula and Zuko sit far enough from the camp that they cannot be overheard, and close enough that they can see exactly who might be trying to overhear. They cup fire in their hands for light. Their friends will be in the room. Largely, Azula insists because Sokka knows almost all of her plans anyway. If they turn against them, they will likely do it together. And you trust Sokka? Zuko insists. Azula rolls her eyes. Just because you're semi-permanently attached to his face doesn't mean
I trust him, she replies, which is unfair.
He's your strategist,
Zuko responds, firm.
and your friend.
Azula doesn't deny this, which is enough for Zuko. Uncle Iroh doesn't make the cut. Zuko is a little sad about this, because Azula speaks about meeting Prince Iroh for tea regularly in the palace. Zuko thinks that Iroh sounds like he was the only person in the palace who cared about her because she was Azula, and not because she was the princess. But Iroh is also loyal to the White Lotus and has a claim to the throne, and these two facts disqualify him. Zuko looks out back toward the camp.
What about Chief Hakoda?
Chief Hakoda seems a little bewildered at first to be the only adult in the room. He tries to bring Bato with him, which is quickly shut down. She has mostly agreed to Hakoda's presence because there are two ways in which the Water Tribe could betray Azula. The first is from the bottom up, a coup against their chief. In that case, it doesn't matter what Hakoda knows. The second way is that Hakoda betrays them directly, in which case... well, perhaps he would betray Azula and Zuko, but he won't betray his own children. If that treason happens, it won't matter whether or not he was in the room. Azula situates herself behind the rock city and looks out to her friends. War is on our doorstep, Azula explains, head held high. As much as the adults of this camp might see us as children, we are all well aware that there are no children in war. She pauses, looking to Sokka, who nods at her. I have a great many allies to this final battle, but the more allies, the more opportunity for betrayal. So, Sokka takes up, sounding unduly cheery for the moment. They're going to have to work on that. Between my planning and Azula's innate distrust of anyone and everyone, we have come up with multiple scenarios. If you're in this room, it's because you get to know all of them. Azula's mouth curls into a smile. Almost all of them, she corrects. Sokka looks up at her with a grin. Almost all of them, he agrees. Minus the one in which we all betray Azula and she probably beheads us. Azula shrugs. He's not that far off. You will need to memorize the scenarios, Azula explains. Though not all situations will call for a change of action for you personally, and you will need to know how changes of plan will be communicated. We will begin with scenario 1, in which everything goes according to plan. The daily... Nope! Sokka interrupts. Azula turns a frown on him. Sorry, your fieriness. You don't get to tell the stories. Azula ignores what sounds like a half laugh from her brother and widens her eyes at Sokka. You're great. Really looking forward to you being on the throne, buddy. But you are not good at telling stories.
Azula glares.
Sokka wilts a little and she finally sighs, relenting. Tell us about scenario 1 then, Water Tribe. They stay in the tent for hours, protected by Toph's feet, ensuring that nobody is close enough to hear. They run through scenario after scenario, test their friends to ensure that they understand their roles in situations of ever-shifting sands, and take questions and pointers. Through this all, Azula is very aware that Chief Hakoda has said nothing. He watches with his arms crossed, nodding slightly from time to time. Nobody else gets to know all the ins and outs? Aang asks, standing at the head of the board. He's looking down at himself in the throne room with most of his friends. He's frowning, but it looks like it's thoughtful rather than worried. They will know what they need to, Sokka responds. So if something has to change for them, they can change. But only we know the extent of it, and because nobody else knows the whole picture, we know who betrayed us based on how things are going wrong. Sokka grins again. Azula looks up at Chief Hakoda again, only to find that she's being watched. She squares her shoulders. Okay, Aang says. Azula is pleased. Aang may be a ridiculous child, but they need the Avatar for this to work. I like it. It's clever. And I like that I don't have to kill the Fire Lord. This would have been so much simpler with a little matter, Azula grumbles. Chief Hakoda finally clears his throat. The children look to him. If he undermines her, it will be bad. Azula is aware that Chief Hakoda is the only adult in the room, and some of these children will take his words seriously simply based on that fact. She holds herself very still as Chief Hakoda prepares to speak.
First,
Chief Hakoda says,
I would like to extend my gratitude for being allowed into this room. I do not take that lightly. Thank you.
Azula slants a glance to Sokka, who is beaming, and then to Zuko, who's doing the making himself small thing in the corner.
I also want to say that this is a brilliant plan. Chief Hakoda continues. I know that you joked about not trusting anyone, but to build a plan in which you win even if you are betrayed and weed out the betrayal while doing it, it speaks volumes to your preparation and to your intelligence. Both of you.
Hakoda smiles at his son and then at Azula. Azula holds herself back from rolling her eyes and freely extinguishes whatever strange stray emotion tries to spark the life inside her.
However,
Chief Hakoda continues, and Azula feels her face fall into a glare. This is where it's going to get complicated then. Chief Hakoda moves closer to the rock table again, looking down into the city.
I think I spotted a weakness in Scenario 5. Can we move back to before you get to the throne room?
Ugh, Scenario 5. Azula hates Scenario 5. Yeah, Sokka admits, moving the pieces back into position. We know, we're trying to figure it out. We have a couple of minutes, it's really not long, in which Ozai could potentially act. He could leave out of the back of the throne room here. Sokka points, and he won't get far because the Dai Li have barricaded the routes to evacuation, but it would still throw a spanner in the works.
We need a distraction,
Hakoda says, staring at the board and tapping his index finger against his chin.
Preferably something that could get rid of some of the guards too.
But Ozai's fire comes back then, so it's gotta be a less flammable distraction. Azula's stuck here, Sokka points, with me and Zuko and Toph. Toph definitely needs to stay because we needed to ensure that she gets there. Katara would be perfect, but if she leaves her station...
Yeah, I see it.
Hakoda continues. Azula has been through this before, and frankly, if Sokka can't fix this hole in the plan, then Azula isn't sure it's fixable. They might need to go back to the drawing board. Azula feels a presence approaching and looks up to see that Zuko has unfolded himself from the corner. He's watching the movements on the board with a troubled look on his face, as if he cares enough about their planning to be fully engaged in the annoying mess that is Scenario 5. And then Zuko looks up and meets Azula's eyes, and he looks... apologetic? He says, awkward and stilted, but it makes the water tribe bear stop talking and look up at him. Zuko takes a breath.
I know how you fix it.
He looks back toward Azula.
But you're not going to like it.
Sokka steps back to give Zuko room to approach the palace on the board, and he does. Zuko picks up his piece from next to Azula's, looks at it for a moment, and then places it squarely in the throne room. It's not happening, Azula insists, up until the moment that Zuko shows exactly how effective he can be as a distraction. Amidst the screaming panic to follow, Azula laughs and thinks, oh yes, this could work. There is a brief period of time in which everyone is kind of angry at Zuko. Even Azula seems annoyed with his intrusion on her plans. Zuko is expecting them to ignore him, or perhaps to berate him. He did, after all, not think through the ramifications of his demonstration at all. But instead, after a few moments of annoyance, everyone seems to shrug it off. Well, Chief Hakoda does look at him and say quite firmly,
Zuko, please do not do that again.
But afterwards, it's like it doesn't matter. Zuko spends the rest of the night waiting for the fallout, for someone to give him the cold shoulder, or for him to be told he should sleep outside, or for Sokka to look at him without smiling. It doesn't happen. Zuko doesn't understand these people at all. But where not understanding them used to be its own source of worry, he now feels himself relaxing into it. The days draw in and in toward the battle. Azula feels that she can map out time in everyone's muscles, how everyone gets increasingly tense as the hours pass. Azula stays very, very calm. And she trains very, very hard. The day before they leave for the battle, Zuko thinks about being on Azula's ship. He thinks about how he accepted the inevitability of death on that journey. It had been almost calming to accept death, to know that his promise to Azula meant that he wouldn't even fight it. Zuko was less calm now that he wants to survive. He's less calm now that he cares about so many people, now that losing even one of them would tear at his soul. They're all quiet that night. War doesn't come for them. They go to the war.